They said the rusted grist mill wasn't worth the gas it took to get there, that it was nothing but a collapsing relic buried deep in the woods of West Virginia. But 3 months after Clara Whitmore unlocked its warped wooden doors, she would walk into a bank and sign papers that turned her from a widow sleeping in her car into a woman worth millions. And the truth of what she found inside that mill would make her question everything she thought she knew about loss, luck, and the quiet ways. People leave behind second chances, but on the night it all began, none of that existed yet. Only the steady drumming of rain on the roof of her dented Toyota Camry and the ache in her chest that had never really gone away since the hospital room went silent. The parking lot behind the grocery store was half-lit, buzzing with flickering fluorescent lights that cast long, tired shadows across cracked asphalt, and Clara sat curled in the driver's seat, a thin blanket wrapped around her shoulders, watching rivulets of rain race down the windshield like they were in a hurry to be somewhere better. 6 months earlier, she had been in a small house in Ohio, arguing with her husband over whether they should repaint the kitchen cabinets, a meaningless, ordinary argument that now felt like a luxury she hadn't known to appreciate, because 2 weeks after that, he had gotten the diagnosis, and 4 months after that, he was gone, leaving behind a stack of medical bills so high it felt like they had weight, like they were pressing her down into the ground. The house went next, swallowed up by foreclosure with the same indifferent efficiency as everything else, and what little savings they had disappeared into treatments that bought time, but not enough of it. And suddenly Clara, who had once measured her days in errands and dinners and weekend plans, was measuring them in how long she could stretch a tank of gas, how late she could stay parked before someone knocked on her window and told her to move along. She had gotten good at being invisible, at slipping into the background of places that weren't meant for people to stay, learning which rest stops were safer, which parking lots had security that didn't care, which nights were cold enough that sleep came in short, shivering bursts instead of anything that felt like rest, and somewhere along the way, she had stopped thinking of it as temporary, because temporary implies an end, and she couldn't see one anymore. That's why when the letter finally reached her, forwarded through an old address and then another, its edges soft from too many hands and too many sorting machines, she almost didn't open it at all. It looked official in the way that made her stomach tighten, like another bill, another notice, another reminder that she owed more than she could ever repay. She turned it over in her hands for a long time, sitting there in the dim glow of the parking lot lights, before finally tearing it open with a kind of detached resignation, like whatever was inside couldn't make things worse than they already were. The paper inside was thick, formal, stamped with the name of a law office she didn't recognize, and the words didn't make sense at first, not because they were complicated, but because they didn't fit into the reality she had been living in. It said she had inherited something, a property, from a woman named Eleanor Whitmore, and for a moment Clara just stared at the name, trying to place it, digging through memories that felt distant and faded, until it surfaced, a funeral years ago, a quiet, older woman who had stood apart from everyone else, who had spoken only once, briefly, to Clara's husband, her voice low and measured, her expression unreadable. That was it. That was all Clara knew of her. And now, apparently, she had left her a grist mill. Clara let out a short, humorless laugh that fogged the inside of the windshield. Of course, she muttered to herself, shaking her head. Of course it's a mill. The letter went on to describe the property in dry, clinical terms, a decommissioned structure on 12 acres of rural land in West Virginia, long unused, in significant disrepair, with outstanding taxes and no assessed market value worth noting. And each line seemed to confirm what she already believed, that this was nothing more than a burden disguised as a gift, another problem dropped into her lap by a world that didn't seem to have any shortage of them. But then there was that one line, buried near the bottom, easy to overlook if you weren't paying attention. All contents included, ownership transfers upon filing. Clara's eyes lingered on those words, something about them catching her attention in a way she couldn't immediately explain, like a faint signal in a sea of noise. And beneath it, the practical detail that mattered most, the filing fee, $312. She sat back in the seat, the paper trembling slightly in her hands as she did the math without really meaning to, calculating what she had left, how far it would take her, how quickly it would disappear, and the number on the page seemed to stare back at her, demanding a choice she wasn't prepared to make. $312 was almost everything she had. The thin line between scraping by for a few more weeks and having nothing at all, and the idea of spending it on something that sounded like a collapsing ruin in the middle of nowhere felt reckless, almost absurd. But the alternative was what she was already living, night after night in the back of her car, drifting from place to place with no direction, no destination, just the slow erosion of everything she used to be. She folded the letter carefully, more carefully than she had handled anything in weeks, and set it on the passenger seat, staring out at the rain as it continued to fall, steady and relentless. And for the first time in a long while, she felt something shift inside her. Not hope exactly, but something adjacent to it, something uncertain and fragile, like the faintest outline of a possibility. "It's probably nothing," she said aloud, her voice barely audible over the sound of the rain. "Just an old building. Just a mess." But even as she said it, she knew she was already imagining it, picturing the road that would lead her there, the shape of the place, the weight of the key in her hand, and the thought settled into her mind with a quiet persistence she couldn't shake. Because when you have nothing left, nothing to anchor you, even the smallest chance, even one that looks like a rusted, forgotten mill, starts to feel like something you can't afford to ignore. And as Clara sat there in the dim, flickering light of that parking lot, listening to the rain and the distant hum of traffic, she realized that for the first time since everything had fallen apart, she had a decision to make that wasn't just about surviving the next day, but about stepping into something unknown, something that might change everything, even if she couldn't yet see how. They told her to turn back twice before she ever reached the mill. Once at a gas station where an older man behind the counter squinted at the address she showed him and said, "Ain't nothing out there but trees and trouble." And again when her phone lost signal halfway up a narrow road that twisted through dense forest like it didn't want to be found. But Clara kept driving anyway, her hands tight on the wheel, her eyes scanning for any sign that she hadn't made a mistake spending nearly everything she had left on a piece of paper that now sat folded in the glove compartment like it might disappear if she looked at it too long. The farther she went, the quieter it got, the world shrinking down to the hum of her engine and the occasional crack of gravel beneath her tires, until even that faded, and it felt like she had driven out of the life she knew and it as something suspended, untouched. And when she finally saw it, half hidden behind a wall of overgrown trees, it didn't look like an opportunity or a second chance. It looked like proof that she had been right to doubt it all along. The mill leaned slightly to one side, its wooden frame warped and weathered, the paint long since peeled away to reveal gray, splintering boards beneath, and the old water wheel beside it was frozen in place, its paddles broken and sagging as if they had simply given up after years of turning, while rust clung to every metal surface like a second skin, thick and unyielding. Clara parked a few yards away and just sat there for a moment, the engine ticking softly as it cooled, her gaze fixed on the building like she was waiting for it to prove her wrong, to show some sign that it wasn't exactly what it appeared to be. "This is it," she finally said under her breath, the words sounding smaller than she expected in the vast silence around her. "This is what I spent everything on." For a second, the urge to leave was overwhelming, to start the car, turn around, and pretend she had never come, because at least the life she had been living, as difficult as it was familiar, predictable in its own harsh way. And this felt like stepping into something she didn't understand, something that might swallow her whole if she wasn't careful. But then she thought about the parking lot, about the night spent curled in the back seat of her car, about the slow, creeping realization that she couldn't keep going like that forever, and the thought anchored her just enough to open the door and step out into the cool, damp air. The ground beneath her feet was soft with fallen leaves and damp earth, the smell of wood and moss thick in the air, and as she approached the mill, each step felt heavier than the last, like she was walking toward a truth she wasn't sure she wanted to face. The key the lawyer had sent was cold in her hand, its metal worn smooth with age, and when she reached the door, a heavy wooden thing reinforced with rusted iron bands, she hesitated, her fingers tightening around the key as she stared at the lock. "Just open it," she murmured to herself, as if saying it out loud would make it easier, and after a moment, she slid the key into the lock and turned it. It resisted at first, the mechanism stiff from years of disuse. But then there was a sharp, echoing click that seemed too loud in the stillness, and the door creaked open just enough for her to push it the rest of the way. The smell hit her immediately. Old wood, dust, something faintly metallic, and she stepped inside slowly, her eyes adjusting to the dim light that filtered through gaps in the walls. The interior was larger than she expected, the ceiling high and supported by thick wooden beams that looked like they had been there for a century, and the machinery, massive, rusted, silent, stood in place like monuments to a time that had long since passed, gears locked in place, belts hanging loose and brittle. It should have felt abandoned, completely empty, but it didn't. There was something else here, something subtle but undeniable, like the faint echo of presence, and Clara found herself moving more carefully, her senses sharpening as she took it all in. She pulled her phone from her pocket and turned on the flashlight, the narrow beam cutting through the dimness and revealing details she hadn't noticed at first. Footprints in the dust that weren't entirely faded, a lantern sitting on a nearby workbench, its glass surprisingly clean, and in the far corner, a small area that looked used. A folded blanket rested on a wooden chair, and beside it, a metal desk that seemed out of place among the older equipment, its surface cluttered with papers that hadn't been there long enough to gather the same thick layer of dust as everything else. Clara's pulse quickened as she approached, a mix of curiosity and unease settling in her chest, because this didn't fit with what she had been told, with what she had expected, and the closer she got, the more certain she became that the mill wasn't as empty as it looked. "Hello," she called out, her voice echoing faintly through the space, but there was no response, only the soft creak of the building settling around her. She reached the desk and hesitated for a moment before touching anything, as if she were afraid it might confirm something she wasn't ready to face. But then she brushed aside that hesitation and began to look more closely. The papers were organized, not scattered, and though she didn't immediately understand what she was looking at, she could tell they mattered. Lists, notes, documents with headings that suggested structure, purpose, and tucked neatly beneath the desk was a wooden box, its surface worn but intact, a small lock securing it shut. Clara crouched down, her breath catching slightly as she ran her fingers along the edge of the box, a strange sense of anticipation building in her chest, because whatever this was, it felt deliberate, like something left behind for a reason. Her first instinct was to leave it alone, to walk away and focus on the more immediate problem of what she was going to do next, but the thought didn't last long, because deep down, she knew she wouldn't be able to ignore it, not now that she had seen it. She searched the desk again, more carefully this time, and it didn't take long to find what she was looking for, a small key, taped discreetly to the underside, hidden just enough that it wouldn't be obvious to anyone who wasn't paying attention. Her hands trembled slightly as she peeled it free and held it up to the light, her mind racing with possibilities she couldn't quite form into coherent thoughts. And when she finally brought it to the lock and turned it, the soft click that followed felt heavier than it should have, like it carried more weight than a simple mechanism opening. Slowly, she lifted the lid of the box, her eyes fixed on its contents as they came into view. And for a moment, she didn't understand what she was seeing. Just papers, notebooks, letters tied together with string. But then her gaze landed on a single item near the top, a worn notebook labeled in careful handwriting, "Accounts and Holdings." The words seemed to settle into her mind with a quiet intensity, and as she reached for the notebook and opened it, flipping past the first few pages filled with numbers and notes that didn't immediately make sense, she felt something shift again, that same faint, fragile sense of possibility from before, only stronger now, more defined. And when she finally began to piece together what the numbers meant, what the entries represented, her breath caught in her throat, her heart beginning to race, as the reality of what she was holding slowly started to take shape. Because this wasn't just an old mill, and whatever had been hidden here all this time was something far bigger than she had ever imagined. Clara didn't realize how long she had been sitting on the cold wooden floor of the mill until the light outside began to fade, the golden afternoon slipping quietly into evening as shadows stretched across the warped boards, and the air inside turned colder, heavier. But she barely noticed. Her entire world narrowed to the worn notebook in her hands, and the impossible truth unfolding line by line as she read. Because what she had first taken for random numbers and outdated records was something else entirely, something precise, intentional, and meticulously tracked over years, decades even. And the more she read, the more the shape of it became undeniable. This wasn't just bookkeeping. It was a map of value hidden in plain sight, a record of land leases, mineral rights, royalty agreements tied to companies she vaguely recognized, and each entry was dated, updated, cross-referenced like the work of someone who had known exactly what they were doing and had trusted no one else to keep track of it. "This can't be real," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the stillness. But the numbers didn't change. They didn't soften or shrink under doubt. They just sat there, steady and undeniable. And when she reached the back pages and saw the totals, neatly written, carefully calculated, her hands began to shake in a way she couldn't control. Because even if she was misunderstanding some of it, even if she was only half right, the scale of it was still staggering. She forced herself to slow down, to breathe, flipping back through the pages more carefully now, tracing the progression of it all. And that's when she noticed the pattern, the story beneath the numbers. Eleanor Whitmore hadn't just owned this land. She had studied it, researched it, waited, and when the mill stopped being profitable, when everyone else would have sold or walked away, she had done the opposite. She had held on, quietly negotiating leases with small energy companies, allowing limited access to parts of the land while retaining full ownership, collecting royalties that grew year after year as those companies expanded, merged, and increased production. It wasn't luck. It was patience. It was strategy. And most of all, it was invisible to anyone who wasn't looking closely. Clara felt a strange mix of emotions rising in her chest: shock, disbelief, and something deeper, something almost like respect for a woman she had barely known, a woman who had lived and died in obscurity while quietly building something that no one else had noticed. Her eyes moved to the stack of letters tied with string, and after a moment's hesitation, she picked them up, her fingers brushing against the rough paper as she untied the knot and opened the first one. The handwriting was steady, deliberate, and as she began to read, the voice that came through the words felt calm, measured, and unmistakably certain. It wasn't addressed to Clara specifically, not by name, but it didn't need to be. "If you are reading this," the letter began, "then you are likely standing where most people would see nothing but decay, and I suppose I can't blame them. This place was never meant to impress anyone. It was meant to be overlooked." Clara swallowed hard, her eyes scanning the lines as the meaning settled deeper with each word. Eleanor wrote about the mill, about how it had once been the center of everything in that area, how it had fed families and built a small, quiet community around it, and how, when that time passed, when the world moved on and the mill became obsolete, she had realized something most people didn't. That value doesn't disappear, it changes form. And those who are patient enough to see that change can build something far greater than what was lost. Clara's grip on the paper tightened slightly as she continued reading, the words pulling her in, grounding the overwhelming reality of the numbers she had just seen into something she could understand. Eleanor described how she had learned about mineral rights almost by accident, how she had spent years reading, asking questions, refusing to sell even when offers came in that would have seemed generous to anyone else, and how she had slowly, carefully positioned herself in a way that allowed her to benefit from what lay beneath the land without ever giving it up. "People will always underestimate what they don't understand," the letter continued, "and they will walk away from things that appear broken without ever asking what might still be hidden inside. That is where opportunity lives." Clara felt something shift inside her again, something stronger than before, something that pushed back against the months of exhaustion and quiet defeat she had been carrying, and for the first time since her husband had died, the weight of everything she had lost felt different, not gone, not replaced, but no longer the only thing defining her. She reached for another letter, then another, each one adding pieces to the story, explaining the agreements, the accounts, the contacts she would need to reach out to, all laid out with a clarity that felt almost unreal, as if Eleanor had known exactly what would happen, exactly who would end up here one day, sitting on this same floor, trying to make sense of it all. By the time Clara found the final letter at the bottom of the stack, the light outside had nearly disappeared, the interior of the mill dim and shadowed once more, but she didn't bother turning on her phone flashlight. She didn't want anything to break the moment as she unfolded the paper and began to read. To whoever inherits this place, it said, I did not leave you a mill. I left you a choice. You can see this as it appears. A burden, a relic, something to sell and forget, where you can look closer, ask questions, and understand what it truly is. I cannot tell you what to do, only that I once stood where you are now, and I chose not to walk away. Clara lowered the letter slowly, her mind racing, her heart pounding in a way she hadn't felt in a long time. And as she sat there in the quiet, surrounded by rusted machinery and the fading echoes of a life she had never known, she realized that everything had changed, not just her circumstances, but her understanding of what was possible. The woman who had slept in her car the night before, who had believed she was at the end of her story, was no longer the same person sitting on that floor, because now she held something real, something tangible, not just money or property, but a path forward, a reason to stand up and move instead of just drifting from one day to the next. Outside, the last light of day slipped below the trees, and the mill settled into darkness once again. But this time it didn't feel empty. It didn't feel like a place that had been forgotten. It felt like something waiting, something alive with possibility. And as Clara folded the letter carefully and held it in her hands, she took a slow, steady breath and made a decision that would carry her far beyond this moment, far beyond the broken edges of the life she thought she had lost, because sometimes the thing that looks like the end isn't the end at all. It's just the place where everything you didn't expect finally begins.